Bob Hansen was a man like many others. He wasn't famous, nor was he wealthy. He had a steady job working as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in a bustling city. His life was ordinary, predictable. Bob lived alone in a modest apartment in the city's outskirts, surrounded by stacks of paperwork and the hum of distant traffic. He wasn't unhappy, but deep down, he had always wondered if there was more to life than this. Maybe something exciting, something meaningful, something that would make him feel alive. At 42, Bob's life hadn't turned out as he had hoped. When he was younger, he had dreams of becoming someone important, a business owner, a leader, a man of influence. But as the years passed, he settled into a quiet existence, managing numbers on spreadsheets for a living. The young, ambitious Bob had faded into the background, replaced by the man who simply showed up to work every day, did his job, and went home. He told himself it was enough. But sometimes, when he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the graying hair and the wrinkles that marked the passage of time, he couldn't help but wonder what could have been. Bob's friends had moved on with their lives. Some were married, some had children, and a few were running their own businesses. They all seemed to have found their place in the world, while Bob felt like he was stuck in a never-ending loop of mediocrity. Yet he didn't complain. He didn't want to burden others with his dissatisfaction. So, he kept his feelings to himself, pretending that everything was just fine. On a Tuesday evening in early March, Bob was sitting in his apartment, enjoying his usual routine. He was watching a game show on TV, eating takeout from a nearby Chinese restaurant. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was his life, and he was used to it. He didn't expect much out of it, and that's probably what kept him from feeling truly unhappy. Bob bought a lottery ticket every week. Not because he believed he would win, he knew the odds were slim. But the idea of winning, even just for a moment, felt like a brief escape from the monotony. It was like a little dream, a daydream he could indulge in every now and then. So, every Tuesday, he would buy his ticket, stick it in his wallet, and forget about it until the drawing came. That night, after the game show had ended, Bob absent-mindedly checked his phone. The lottery results were out. He lazily pulled up the page, scrolled down to the numbers, and froze. The numbers matched. It didn't register at first. He stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process the reality in front of him. The numbers were identical. The ones he had chosen, the ones printed on his ticket. The jackpot was $100 million. He blinked, then rubbed his eyes. This couldn't be real. He checked the ticket again. He checked his phone again. But the numbers were the same. His heart raced and his hands began to tremble. He didn't know what to do, how to react. This wasn't just some lucky win, this was life-altering. Bob could barely grasp the gravity of the moment. His first instinct was to call someone. Anyone. But who? His friends. They would think he was joking. His family. They'd think he was losing his mind. So, he sat there, in stunned silence, holding his lottery ticket like a piece of fragile glass that could shatter at any moment. The next few days passed in a blur. Bob contacted the lottery authorities to confirm his win. It was all real. The $100 million was his. He couldn't believe it. It wasn't just the money that stunned him, it was the possibilities. A new life. A new future. He could buy whatever he wanted, go wherever he wanted. He could leave behind his ordinary existence and become someone extraordinary. But even as the excitement of the win filled him with joy, there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. This couldn't be real, could it? People didn't win the lottery and live happily ever after. There had to be a catch. Bob's life changed overnight. His work, which had once been his primary focus, no longer seemed important. He quit his job without a second thought. The luxury penthouse he moved into was a far cry from the cramped apartment he had once called home. The city skyline stretched out in front of him like a promise, a vision of everything he had ever wanted. He bought a sports car, a sleek black Ferrari, and took it out for drives just to feel the rush of speed. He bought designer clothes, expensive watches, and filled his penthouse with the finest furniture. He even hired a personal chef to cook him meals that were beyond anything he'd ever tasted. Everything was perfect. For the first time in his life, Bob felt powerful. He felt like he was in control of his destiny. People admired him. He wasn't the quiet, invisible man in the office anymore. He was Bob Hansen, the lottery winner. He had become someone people wanted to know, someone they wanted to be associated with. His phone rang constantly, filled with calls from friends, old acquaintances, and even strangers offering him deals, investments, and opportunities. But as the weeks went by, the initial excitement of wealth began to wear off. The parties grew tiresome. The luxury, which had once seemed like a dream, now felt hollow. Bob was surrounded by people who only wanted his money. They flattered him, laughed at his jokes, but he could tell they didn't care about him. They cared about the money. His family, too, began to change. They weren't there for him when he was struggling. But now, they called him often, inviting him to family gatherings, talking about their financial troubles and hinting at how much help they needed. Bob had always been the one to help, to give when others were in need, but now he was starting to feel like a tool. A means to an end. His friends, once a steady part of his life, now only reached out when they needed something. He had given away thousands, maybe even millions, to help them start businesses, pay off debts, and fund their dreams. But as time passed, he realized that the people who once saw him as just another guy were now treating him like a cash machine. Bob had everything, and yet he felt emptier than he had before he won the lottery. The loneliness that had once been his constant companion had returned, but now it was worse. It was more profound, more isolating. He had people around him, but none of them were real. None of them cared about him. They cared about his money. As Bob spent more and more on extravagant purchases, he found himself slipping deeper into a financial hole. The investments he made weren't yielding the returns he had hoped for. He had hired financial advisors, but they had made risky decisions that resulted in significant losses. The money was disappearing faster than he could keep track of. At first, it was small things. The penthouse was no longer affordable, so he downsized to a smaller apartment. The sports car was sold off, replaced by a more practical, but still luxurious, vehicle. But the problems began to snowball. Bob found himself living paycheck to paycheck once again, despite the fact that he had once been a millionaire. And as the money dwindled, so did the people around him. The friends, the family, the hangers-on, they all disappeared. No one wanted to be around someone who was no longer wealthy. By the time Bob realized how far he had fallen, it was too late. The money was gone. The lifestyle was gone. The friends, the fake admirers, all gone. A year had passed since Bob won the lottery. And now, a year later, he was walking down the same streets he had walked before. Only this time, he wasn't walking with a sense of pride or excitement. He wasn't walking with the confidence of a man who had it all. He was walking with the weight of his failures on his shoulders. His clothes were ragged, his shoes worn down to the soles. He didn't have a home anymore. His savings were gone, his investments wasted. Bob had hit rock bottom. The man who had once had everything was now living on the streets, barely able to survive. He had no place to go, no one to turn to. Bob's life had come crashing down in a way he never imagined. He had spent months telling himself it was just a temporary setback, a series of unfortunate events that would eventually right themselves. But 1 year after winning the lottery, the reality was harsh and undeniable. He stood on the street corner, shivering from the cold, the city bustling around him. The tall glass buildings reflected the bright lights of the night, a world of wealth and opportunity that Bob no longer had access to. He had spent his days sitting in the same spot, waiting for the moment when someone would notice him, offer him a job, or maybe even a chance to rebuild his life. But no one ever did. Bob had a few coins in his pocket, the remnants of a fast food meal he'd managed to scrounge up earlier in the day. His stomach growled with hunger, but he didn't have the strength to care about food anymore. His thoughts were consumed by the question of how he'd ended up here. He had once been the man everyone envied, the one with endless possibilities. Now, he was just another homeless man, invisible to the world around him. The cold wind bit at his skin, but the numbness in his chest was far worse. There was a deep emptiness, a longing for something, for someone, that he couldn't explain. He thought back to his old life, to the moments when he felt powerful and in control, and it made him sick. That life, the life of luxury and excess, felt like a distant dream now. It was as if it had never even happened. It was then that he saw her. A woman, slightly older than him, standing at the corner of the street, looking down at her phone, oblivious to the world around her. Bob's eyes followed her, and for some reason, something about her presence caught his attention. He had no idea why. Maybe it was the way she stood there, so confident, or maybe it was the fact that she seemed like someone who belonged in this world, someone who could make things happen. The woman looked up, noticing Bob staring at her, and their eyes locked for a brief moment. Bob felt a strange chill run down his spine. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something calculating. She smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a smile that seemed to say, "I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you've done." Without a word, she approached him. Bob, too tired to move, stood still, unsure of what to do. "Are you Bob Hanson?" she asked, her voice smooth but firm. It wasn't a question of curiosity, it was a statement. Bob blinked. How did she know his name? "Yeah." "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "I'm someone who's been following your story," she said, her eyes narrowing with interest. "I know what happened to you. And I know you want to get back on top." Bob's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't told anyone about his situation. How could she possibly know? But before he could voice his thoughts, she continued. "I have an opportunity for you. But it's not going to be easy. In fact, it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done." She reached into a bag and pulled out a small, sleek business card. "You come to this address tomorrow at noon. No excuses. I'll explain everything when you get there." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Bob standing there, speechless. His mind raced. Was this some kind of scam? Was he just a target for more people looking to exploit him? But something inside him told him to go. Maybe this was the chance he'd been waiting for, the chance to get his life back. The next day, Bob found himself standing in front of a sleek, glass building in the heart of the city. The address on the business card led him to an executive suite, one of those places that seemed to belong to someone important, someone who knew how to play the game. The contrast to the grimy streets where he'd spent the last few months was striking. He entered the building, his heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. A receptionist directed him to a waiting area, where he sat, trying to calm his nerves. The minutes dragged on as he wondered what exactly he had gotten himself into. He had no idea what this woman wanted from him, but part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would be a turning point in his life, for better or worse. Finally, a door opened and the woman from yesterday appeared, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "Bob, right on time," she said, gesturing for him to enter the office. The office was modern, minimalist, with a large desk at the center. Behind it sat a man in a suit, tall, with an air of authority that immediately made Bob feel out of place. "Please, take a seat," the woman said, motioning to a chair across from the desk. Bob hesitated, then sat down, his eyes shifting between the two of them. "What's going on? What is this about?" The man behind the desk leaned forward, folding his hands. "We've been watching you, Bob. Your story, your rise and fall, it's fascinating. People like you don't come around often. You were given everything, and you lost it all. But that makes you perfect for what we have in mind." Bob's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The woman spoke up. "We want to give you a second chance. We can help you rebuild everything, but we need something in return. We need you to be part of a project. A very special project. A project that involves wealth, influence, and power. We are offering you the chance to be someone again. But you'll have to work for it. You'll have to prove you're worthy of the opportunity." Bob couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What kind of project?" The man smiled, but there was something unsettling in his gaze. "A project that could make you a lot more money than you ever dreamed of. But we'll need your cooperation. We'll need you to trust us, completely." Bob's mind was racing. A second chance. He'd never been offered something like this before. But the question remained, what were they asking of him? What did they want? Before he could respond, the woman slid a folder across the desk to him. Here's the first step. If you're willing to take it, the rest will fall into place. But you have to make a choice now. We don't give second chances to those who hesitate. Bob opened the folder, scanning through the contents. It was filled with contracts, proposals, and a few names he didn't recognize, all connected to shady business dealings, investments, and high-stakes financial games. It was risky. Dangerous, even. But it was his chance. His one shot to climb back to the top. Bob's decision to join the project was the beginning of a new chapter, one that was as thrilling as it was terrifying. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and negotiations. He was surrounded by wealthy, influential people, each with their own agenda. Some seemed genuinely interested in his story, while others saw him as a tool, a pawn in a much larger game. As Bob navigated this new world, he began to feel a familiar sense of emptiness. The money, the power, the people, none of it felt real. It was all built on a foundation of lies and manipulation, and Bob was starting to question whether he had made the right choice. But he couldn't back out now. He had come too far. He had to keep going, no matter the cost. Bob sat on a park bench, staring blankly at the horizon. The city around him bustled with life, people moving with purpose, while he felt more disconnected than ever. His clothes, once a symbol of status, were now worn and ragged, just like his hopes. The past year had been a whirlwind of choices, risks, and ultimately, despair. The second chance he had been offered had promised power and success, but it had cost him more than he had been willing to pay. Now, in the silence of his own mind, Bob realized something he had never fully understood before. He had once been the man who thought money was the answer to everything. Winning the lottery had given him everything he thought he wanted: luxury, freedom, recognition. But it had also made him lose sight of what truly mattered. The people who once mattered had faded into the background, and he had become consumed by the chase for more. In the pursuit of wealth, he had lost himself. The project, the deals, the promises, it all felt like an illusion, a game where the stakes were high, but the players were always left empty. His fingers tightened around the worn-out lottery ticket he still kept in his pocket, the ticket that had changed his life. It was a reminder of a time when he had believed he was in control of his fate. But fate, he had learned the hard way, was never something you could control. The woman who had first approached him, the one who had offered him the opportunity to rebuild his life, had been right about one thing: he had lost everything, but he had also gained something. What had seemed like a downfall, a complete collapse, had been the catalyst for something he never could have predicted: self-awareness. Bob now understood that wealth and status were fragile constructs. They were tools, not measures of worth. The real value in life came not from the size of a bank account or the title on a business card, but from the connections he made, the integrity he upheld, and the authenticity with which he lived. Power, as he had learned from the project, could corrupt, distort, and tear apart even the strongest of men. But humility, kindness, and honesty, those were the things that had the power to heal. He thought of the people he had alienated, the friends he had discarded in favor of faster cars, bigger houses, and meaningless distractions. The woman, the man, the project, they had all been symbols of what he thought he wanted, but none of them could bring him the peace he longed for. It wasn't until he had lost everything that he had found the clarity to realize what he had taken for granted in the past. He stood up from the bench and walked away, not toward the glittering buildings of power or the fleeting promises of wealth, but toward a simple street cafe. There was an old friend there, one he hadn't spoken to in months. A cup of coffee and a long conversation with someone who had always cared for him, that was the kind of wealth he sought now. As Bob walked, he reflected on what he had learned. His journey had been one of self-destruction and self-discovery. He had tasted both the sweetness of victory and the bitterness of defeat. And in the end, the lesson was simple: true happiness doesn't come from what you have, but from who you are and how you treat others. Bob had spent his life chasing the wrong things. But now, finally, he was ready to chase what really mattered: relationships, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, no matter what the world said, he was enough just as he was. The end moral of the story: this story teaches us that success, wealth, and power are fleeting. They can bring temporary pleasure, but they do not define who we are. The true value in life comes from within, through our relationships, our integrity, and our ability to remain grounded despite external circumstances. Bob's journey shows us the dangers of chasing after material success without considering the cost to our well-being and relationships. In the end, happiness is found not in what we possess, but in the choices we make to live with authenticity and kindness.